All right, let's dive right into this explainer and uncover how criminals are literally inventing people from scratch, and they're doing it to completely bypass the financial system. We're looking at the architecture of synthetic identity fraud today. This is a multi-billion-dollar ghost story, and institutions all over the globe are scrambling to understand it.
Imagine for a second a financial threat where the bad guy doesn't steal a real customer's wallet. They don't hack into an existing bank account either. Instead, they manufacture a completely fake customer out of thin air, a total phantom. I mean, what happens to our financial systems when the most basic assumption of all, that a customer is a real, breathing human being, turns out to be completely false? Well, it throws absolutely everything we know about security into total chaos. So, here is our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to hit 5 key areas today. First, we'll meet this invisible criminal. Second, we'll compare theft versus synthetic fraud. Third, we'll track the fraudster's long game. Fourth, we'll look at the dramatic climax known as the bust out. And finally, we'll figure out exactly how we can go about catching a phantom customer. Okay, let's kick things off with part 1. Meet the invisible criminal, or as it's often called, the Frankenstein identity. You know, when we usually talk about traditional fraud, it almost always involves taking over an established account. But synthetic identity fraud, it flips that entire model upside down. At its core, this is a typology where criminals combine real personal information with completely fabricated details to create a totally false identity. The criminal isn't impersonating someone who already exists in a bank's database. No, they're manufacturing a brand new customer that appears just credible enough to slip through the cracks of onboarding or credit checks or servicing processes. And that makes it incredibly dangerous for lending, payments, deposit accounts, and especially modern digital onboarding, where algorithms are making split-second decisions without ever seeing a human face. So what are the actual ingredients of this phantom customer? The secret to this Frankensteining process isn't just making everything up, because if you invent an entire profile from scratch, systems are usually going to reject it immediately. Instead, they use a single piece of absolute truth. Industry sources describe mixing a real identifier, like a legitimate social security number stolen from a child, or someone without any credit history, with a completely false name, a fake date of birth, and a fabricated address. You stitch all these together, and boom, you've given birth to a brand new, plausible identity that the system has never seen before, but it has just enough reality to trick those basic verification algorithms. Moving right along to part 2, theft versus synthetic fraud, and why this phantom is so darn hard to catch. What's really fascinating here is the professional distinction between these two crimes. The CFPB defines identity theft as a fraud committed using the identifying information of another real person without their authority. In that scenario, there's a clear identifiable victim. But a synthetic identity, it doesn't fully belong to any one real person. Think about it. If a fraudster maxes out a credit card using your actual name, you're going to call the bank and complain, right? You freeze the account. But if a fraudster maxes out a card under a synthetic identity, nobody calls the bank. The alarm bells simply don't ring because the victim doesn't actually exist to raise them. It's just this silent drain on the system. The Federal Reserve actually hits the nail on the head here. Their interagency authentication guidance makes this distinction incredibly clear. They state, unlike typical identity theft, where a real person's identity is stolen and used, a synthetic identity is a completely fabricated identity that does not correspond to any actual person. This right here is the core reason why these typologies are just vastly harder to detect and remediate. They lack those traditional tripwires of normal fraud, which means banks have to proactively hunt for really subtle anomalies, rather than just sitting back and waiting for a panicked customer to call their hotline. All right, let's look at part 3, the fraudster's long game, maturing the monster. This is where the psychology of the crime gets genuinely fascinating, because this is not a smash-and-grab robbery. It's a stealthy, slow-burn cultivation. Let's walk through this life cycle. On day 1, the synthetic identity might be used to simply open a low-risk, no-fee deposit account just to establish a footprint. No credit is requested yet. They literally just want to exist in the database. Fast forward to month 3, they get a small line of credit, like a secured credit card, and they actually pay their bills perfectly. They might even set up automated payments to build a flawless history. By month 12, they've built a pristine, trustworthy credit profile. They act like the absolute perfect customer, eventually getting auto loans, personal loans, premium credit cards. The fraudster is methodically feeding and watering this fake identity, waiting patiently for month 24 or whenever they decide their credit limit is high enough for the grand finale. Which brings us to part 4, the bust out and beyond, the climax and the fallout.
The bust out is exactly what it sounds like. This is the phase where the fraudster violently and suddenly exploits that beautifully built up credit profile. They don't just miss a payment, no. They might coordinate dozens of these cultivated phantoms to max out high limit cards simultaneously, extracting hundreds of thousands of dollars in a single weekend. They take out massive personal loans, empty their cash advances, just rapid misuse across the board. And then the phantom customer simply vanishes into thin air. They stop making payments, and the financial institutions are left holding the bag, trying to collect massive debt from a person who literally never existed in the first place. Now, here's the real kicker. This is absolutely not just an onboarding problem. Getting a fake ID through the front door is just the first domino to fall. From there, the infection spreads throughout the entire financial network, contaminating every single layer of the institution it touches. Because this is where synthetic fraud transforms into much wider illicit finance risks. This phantom identity sits right at the intersection of basic application fraud and broader systemic financial crime. Once they're inside, that highly trusted synthetic identity can be used to obtain payment instruments, access transactional infrastructure, move illicit proceeds internationally, or operate mule accounts. It basically acts as the hidden, underground plumbing for other massive financial crimes like trafficking or illegal gambling. You effectively have a totally fake person acting as the perfect, untraceable middleman who is laundering very real money. So, how do we stop it? Part 5. Catching a phantom customer and evolving our defenses. The biggest danger for firms right now is falling into the trap of static verification. Let me emphasize that word, static. When we say static verification, we mean running a simple checklist. Is the SSN formatted correctly? Yes. Does the zip code exist? Yes. Approved. If you rely on rigid controls that focus too narrowly on just checking for a document's presence or doing basic data matching, you are gonna lose. Remember that Frankenstein concept we talked about? A real identifier paired with fabricated details produces a partial appearance of legitimacy. On a static piece of paper or a standard web form, the phantom looks entirely real because parts of it actually are real. To defeat dynamic, stitched-together identities, you just cannot rely on static checkbox security. To really stop this, institutions have to deploy advanced, multi-layered controls. We're talking about deep identity resolution logic, like does this combination of data actually exist in the real world, or does this social security number trace back to an infant? We need behavioral analysis. For instance, are they navigating the application page like a normal human reading the terms and conditions, or are they a script autofilling data in 0.2 seconds? We need cross-field consistency checks, making sure a 30-year-old applicant doesn't have an SSN that was issued just 2 years ago. We got to use linked account analysis too. Do 50 seemingly unrelated accounts share the exact same obscure phone number or IP address? Add in deep device reviews, and crucially, much stronger scrutiny of thin file or recently created identities. Basically, you have to analyze the entire complex ecosystem of a user to detect when an identity is plausible on paper, but fundamentally false in reality. Which leaves us with this final, somewhat unsettling thought to wrap up our explainer today. Synthetic fraud allows criminals to interact with the financial system as if they were perfectly legitimate contributing members of society. It matures slowly, quietly evolving into massive value movement over time. So I'll leave you with this question. If a customer isn't real, what else in the system is an illusion? Think about that the next time you consider the true integrity of the data powering our global economy. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning what you see.